Okay, I'd say we're probably good to go ahead. There's more people coming on, but I think we'll get started. I was just, David Castle and I were just chatting briefly. I had put in kind of 3 days housekeeping at the front of each of the 3 days with a full half hour. But I don't think we're going to need that. So I may adjust the timing slightly depending on how the discussion goes before the keynote and after the keynote. I certainly don't want to cut off questions and discussion, so we'll kind of play it by ear. And if we do adjust the timing, then it simply means that some folks we may finish a little bit early. So I'll figure that all out once we get a little closer. Just to reiterate again from yesterday, so bearing in mind what I just said about possibly adjusting the time, this is the intended timeline. So a few housekeeping notes, follow up from yesterday. Then we have 45 minutes for keynote and questions and discussion. And then we have the 15-minute breakout instruction. Again, that will be 5 minutes max. The breakout 5, which is kind of the polish and extraction of the statements. And I'll come back to that after the keynote, so we can, at which time I'll also clarify whether or not we're on the original schedule or we're a bit early. And then we do have our half-hour break, which is when those kind of rolled up statements, those actions will be an opportunity to finish adding them to the upvote tool. I've noticed there are a few statements that have been added this morning. And then we have a 45-minute slot starting at 2:30, again, time depending, where each of the 10 cohorts will have 4 minutes to highlight kind of the key elements from their discussions. Also an opportunity to comment on any of the kind of challenges or other things that you think might be useful for another virtual event of this type, if we do one. And then after the plenary cohort reporting, or during that time, people will be able to use the upvoting tool. And I'll be encouraging people to do that, thinking that once the summit is all done and people are back to normal business, they're much less likely to come back to the upvoting tool. So I'm hoping that even if we're done early, we can still use the full time up to the close at 4 o'clock to continue to do that upvoting tool. And I have, so at 3:15, again, if we go up to time, that's an opportunity, and I'll just kind of provide a bit of prodding, or maybe reach out to a few folks just to get the discussion coming, so that everybody not in that moderator role has an opportunity if they wish to say something. So that final part of the day is for all of you to have a chance to say something. Just to give people a sense on the Pechakucha. So a great event, very well done. Everybody really stepped up to the plate. Cohort D planning with the Llama Llama was the clear front runner based on the voting process. Cohorts A and E were pretty closely aligned. Can't remember if it was a tie or pretty close. Those were on open science and sustainability. And then the others, again, fell fairly close to each other in terms of the number of votes. I have a link there to the Llama Llama page and a story about Anna Dudney. For those that are interested, you would think that Anna continues to be very prolific, but like many successful children's books or brands, Anna herself passed away from brain cancer a few years ago, but the Llama Llama franchise continues on. It's still a very popular children's book series. So the one question I did want to ask, and people feel free to type in the text or otherwise ask to be unmuted if you want to speak to the issue. But the question I have for the group, and it's to some degree, I suppose it's mostly for the speakers. Do you want to make that, convert that into a YouTube video so that it's publicly accessible? So Andrew has 2 thumbs up. The only reason I would think for not doing it, if there's any sensitivity around images from a copyright perspective, and Mike is as close to a copyright expert as anybody else, and the person who is using images from the book series. So depending on what people think, I'll give you a couple minutes to let me know if anybody, I've seen a few thumbs up. Any thumbs down or concerns about making the Pechakucha video available? And Mike, if you want to unmute yourself, you might have to, oh, there you go.
I have no problem with it. On the copyright concern front, I think it's fair use under parody, but we might want to talk to an actual expert on that question.
Yeah, no, that was I spent 20 years as a copyright officer, so that was my interpretation. So I think we're fine. I think Andrew's 2 thumbs up probably give one a sense that I think others would benefit from seeing it. So if I don't see any other concerns from folks in the chat, then I'll work with Chantal and Melissa to make sure that it is available. Okay, thanks for that. Now I'm gonna, David, you can unmute yourself. Where the I wanted to give David the opportunity to say what he wanted about me, so it's up to you, David, to introduce the keynote.
Oh, great. I was just typing in the chat that I can't unmute myself, and I thought that this was all controlled centrally, and it appears that it is. So, good morning, everyone, and well, afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. But it's great to be back here for day 3, and so this is kind of fun. Mark is going to hand it over to me to introduce him to give the keynote. But insofar as that just seems like an empty formalism, there's a little bit more to it than that, which is that Mark and Karen Payne and I had written one of the white papers that went into Embryo, one of the more than 100 papers that Nizar spoke of on Monday, in which we talked a little bit about some of the principles and heading to practice for Canada, and thinking about creating an open research commons for Canada. So we have done a little bit of thinking about this on paper recently. So that's in the list of papers that exist in the online archive of all of those white papers for Embryo. But Mark is going to speak today about a global open research commons, and you know, he is easily among the most well-positioned people in Canada to engage us in this topic. You know, having a long history of engagement with open research and open science, originating as far back as when he was a chief librarian, an entrepreneur with Islandora, all the work that he's done as executive director for Research Data Canada, and of course, more recently, some of the very important work that Mark was spearheading for RDA in terms of addressing the really important aspect of setting some standards and protocols around RDA's COVID-19 working group, which released guidelines last summer about how to share, in a principled approach, how to share data globally in response to the pandemic. I also add that in addition to RDA, Mark's worked in many other different contexts, but has more recently with Ernie Boyko and others, myself included, helping to revitalize the Canadian National Coordinating Committee that feeds our domestic activities internationally to CODATA as part of the International Science Council. And so again, I'll just loop back to what I said on Monday, which is I think that we're really at a great point in time in Canada to think about how we can push some of these agendas forward domestically, but being able to understand where we connect up to the evolving standards, the norms that are prevailing internationally, I think is really important. And so I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks, Mark, about where we have opportunities to lead and where we have opportunities to listen and carefully follow what's going on with the global open research commons. So Mark, please go ahead with your keynote. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David. And I am going to, as I tend to, take a few trips off the side initially, just to kind of set a little bit of context. And it's not going to be new context so much for this group, but maybe just a way to further stimulate the conversation. And I would encourage everybody, I think David is going to help facilitate the discussion afterwards. So feel free to put any questions, comments you have in the chat. And if you do wish to ask a question or speak audio versus chat, then probably the best way to do that is to put your virtual hand up. So just a couple of, as I said, side paths here. I've mentioned this webinar a couple of times. It's the Data Sharing Seminar Series for Societies, a very, I think, important series of monthly webinars for the next 10 months. There's 2 already that have happened. The one that took place last week featured Greg Tannenbaum from the Open Research group. What's Open Research Funders Group. And Greg, at one point in his talk, encouraged the 500 or so researchers and colleagues who were in the webinar to be a facilitating vector in your community, which I quite grabbed onto that phrase. And what the context in which Greg was speaking and made that use that phrase was the culture change that we're all aware of and tend to think about as carrots and sticks, or big carrots and little carrots. But I thought Greg's, for those of you that haven't met or heard Greg Tannenbaum, I think it's well worth your while to take a listen to the seminar. And in addition, his colleague, Chris Borg, who is the head of the library at MIT, Chris also had an interesting phrase, again, not new to anybody here, but I think kudos to Chris for being bold. She said, you know, for many researchers, it's better for them if they hoard their data. So it generated a very interesting conversation and additional comments from the group about that concept of hoarding data. And I know I've said it before, I've kind of commented on the fact that sometimes, depending on which lens I'm looking at this ecosystem from, I sometimes ask the question that, you know, when did our funding pipelines, research funding pipelines, become more about promotion and tenure than research and innovation, which many people might consider a provocative statement and not true, or but I think that's another way that I've heard this kind of phrase used. So the first link allows you to sign up for all 12 webinars, and the second link under part 2 is the direct link to all the material slides. It's actually that just going to that landing page is a goldmine of information about this issue. The other side path, I don't know if anybody has seen this before, but this was the article published in the Physical Review Letters, which is kind of one of the core scholarly journals for physics. And this was about the discovery of the Higgs boson particle. I don't know anything about physics, so I didn't read the article. But what struck me was that this was a short article. I think it's a total of 33 or 34 pages, so not unusual for a scholarly article. But 20 some of those pages is a complete list of the over 5,000 authors and contributors, and their institutional affiliations. So when I saw this, I thought we are definitely continuing to use the scholarly publishing paradigm that was developed in the 1600s with little change, listing all these authors, and this paper shall forever be known as the title by G. Odd et al. So, all of those 5,000 authors will largely be forgotten with the exception of that one. So, again, 9 pages of important physics discussion in the context of the discovery of this major discovery, and 24 pages of author names and affiliations. And don't get me wrong, it's critically important to recognize those contributions. The problem is you don't know what the contributions are. You don't know what role each of those 5,000 plus people played in this major experiment. So for me, this is one of the quintessential examples of what's wrong with our scholarly ecosystem if we were to take those same 5,000, that same list of 5,000 authors and the however many hundreds of institutions, and insert the record for this journal article in each of those researchers' ORCID record, have the DataCite records for the data sets, ideally the DataCite record, not just for the publication, but the tables and illustrations within the publication, using something like a PIC identifier for the equipment that was used, Aurora for the institutions, and aggregate and pull all those together into a RAID or research activity identifier, include the actual contributor role taxonomy, which is now overseen by NISO, has currently 14 roles that an individual can play in the scholarly ecosystem. If we were to take that approach rather than the 1664, whatever it was when the first academic journal came out approach, then the impact on each of those 5,100 and some individuals would be much greater than it is otherwise. And it is that PID ecosystem that ultimately will determine our ability to increase the impact of all of those participants. And this is the complex diagram from that PIDS report that I mentioned yesterday. Some people sometimes say, because I tend to talk about PIDs way too much, and some people say you're so PID obsessed, and I go, without persistent IDs and the network or graph of linked research outputs that it creates, we have nothing better than what we had in the 1660s. The final kind of side path that I wanted to take is something that I call Dataversity, which is actually the name of a company that does training for data governance. But for me, Dataversity is the digital or research data equivalent to biodiversity. And one particular phenomenon that I find a particularly good example of this is what's called a whale fall. So when a whale, from blue whales on down, once a whale has lived its life and dies, it falls to the bottom of the ocean and provides an ecosystem, especially if it is a large whale like a blue whale, for 100 years or more. So that whale fall is a critical part of a rich marine ecosystem. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of species of organisms that can be found mostly around whale falls. So if we take the digital equivalent and a research research data that's gathered through an oceanographic trip or other kind of research program. It's generating huge amounts of data. And again, going back to that previous reference to the individual authors or researchers feel that their greatest impact is achieved through hoarding the data. But clearly, I think all of us understand and agree that if the data is openly accessible, the value to that research data ecosystem is much greater. So in the same way that a whale fall provides that canvas for evolution and natural selection, the same, I think, can be said for a Dataversity in the research ecosystem. And the other important thing for me about a whale fall is that it's non-discriminatory. There is no way for a whale to determine what kind of species or where they come from in order to take advantage of the ecosystem that it provides. So I tend to think of research data in a very similar way. It should be an ecosystem of research assets and outputs that are available to anybody, regardless of who they are. And it's that accessibility and reusability that will ultimately drive innovation and discovery, I think, which is why most of the funders put all of that money into the research enterprise. And I was particularly struck by this one. One of the Pechikuchas, the slide was about the research data management it's not butter, it's more like tending a garden. So I was struck by this article I read briefly earlier today, which comes from a very good newsletter out of Stat called the Stat Health Tech. And it was a piece about why the IBM Watson AI-driven health computing platform failed, and ultimately IBM ended up closing. And one of the key reasons for that was because they weren't able to fully leverage and integrate all of the multiple different data sources that they were putting behind this AI-driven health engine. And the simple fact of the matter is that the data was so disparate, so non-standardized all over the map, that even the AI engine they created wasn't able to derive the appropriate kind of outputs that they had hoped for from that mass of data. So we all realize that in order to take advantage of that complex ecosystem, there's a lot of work required. But at the end of the day, clearly that work, whether it's providing rich metadata in a consistent way or otherwise describing that data, that's a very critical piece of the puzzle. So coming to the international Dataversity context, it's very difficult, and we've seen some of the challenges in the COVID-19 context. We have some much heralded examples of genomic and other kinds of data sharing early in the COVID-19 pandemic timeline. But I think we've also seen an institutional or jurisdictional hoarding of data in order to see advantage in that focused context rather than the broader global context. So that fact that data doesn't respect boundaries, but that individuals, institutions, and national jurisdictions require that data to have boundaries adds an extra level of complexity to this research ecosystem. So it's that international Dataversity that I'm going to make a few comments about and highlight in this concept of the Global Open Research Commons. And I realized that while this was the theme of this year's summit, we didn't really talk a lot about the Global Open Research Commons or what it means to have a research commons. And for me, the idea of a global open research commons starts with good principles. These are just two examples, one a global and the other a national example of high-level principles governing data sharing and open science. For those that haven't yet looked at the current draft of the UNESCO Open Science document, I strongly encourage you to take a look. I think it's one of the best, if not the best, principles documents that highlights what countries and researchers should do when it comes to practicing open science and sharing their data. The second one is a shorter, but nevertheless, I think important, in this case, the roadmap for open science out of our Chief Science Advisor's office. Another example of a principles document. So without these principles, we can't get to the policies that can help make the culture change that allow the processes of open science and open data sharing to flourish. And I just to kind of go back to that scholarly publishing challenge. This is an interesting new report out of the ISC, just published last month on opening the record of science. So it focuses in on some of the key developments and technologies that have facilitated this explosion, I suppose you could say, of a more open scholarly publishing landscape. And then on the right, and all of these images, if you want to dive further, have active links. So once you get the PowerPoint deck, you can go down these side paths as well. The Plan S, Coalition S, Coalition, all of these activities are critical parts of opening up the scholarly ecosystem, in these cases, scholarly publishing. The Plan S has folks that are highly supportive, especially those in the open context or like libraries that want to stop having to spend increasing amounts of money every year on closed journals, but also a number of key funders in the ecosystem. So both important efforts. To come a little bit closer now and focus in a bit more on this concept of open research commons. One of the key conversational contexts for this concept of a globally connected suite of infrastructures that researchers use to do their research, whether it's the planning or analysis or creating the actual final outputs. We've come to refer to it, at least in the Research Data Alliance community, as the Global Open Research Commons. Quite simply, it means digital research resources for the common good. So again, like RDA's core mandate, the Global Open Research Commons is about, as you would imagine from using the term commons, is about making the goods that are produced in the research ecosystem more broadly accessible. Excuse me. And then the definition that we've come up with was a global trusted ecosystem that provides seamless access to high quality interoperable research outputs and services. It took about 6 months to arrive at a consensus on a definition of a global open research commons. Now that we have that, hopefully we can get down to some of the specific details for this activity. So the Global Open Research Commons materializes in an RDA interest group. In the RDA community, there are two primary ways to engage in conversation. One is an interest group. So that's a context whereby a group of people meet on a regular basis at the RDA plenaries or between them to talk about common interests. So in this particular case, it's about the Global Open Research Commons. What does it mean, and what how do we describe that Global Open Research Commons, and how do we describe, to use a term that was in some of your questions in the breakouts, what are the rules of participation to allow a research infrastructure to become part of a Global Open Research Commons? So that's the focus of the interest group. And then interest groups can spawn working groups. So the first working group of this Global Open Research Commons is called the Global Open Research Commons Benchmarking Working Group. So what you see on the right-hand side is the typology, if you will, of a research commons. And this is derived from the concept of the commons that was developed by the National Institutes for Health in the US. And it's been a particularly useful typology to engage people in the conversation. And I have a link there to one of the slide decks where the original folks behind the idea describe the typology and what it means to have a health commons in the context of the National Institutes of Health. So the Global Open Research Commons group has decided to start with this typology, and the benchmarking working group has three primary outputs or work packages. One is a set of KPIs and internal success metrics to describe science commons. So what are the kinds of metrics that participating research infrastructures could provide while they're participating in that global commons that would allow them to be measured in a common way. The second one is a list of observable benchmarks of features, structures, and functionality. So this is to go one step further and define a common set of features, what those are in terms of structure and functionality. So this again gets at maybe a little bit more of a detailed matrix for describing the ways that research infrastructures could participate in a global context and how you could measure that, not just in terms of metrics, but also in terms of benchmarking and how an individual research infrastructure could participate in that commons, but also what are the kind of rules, minimal rules of engagement for being part of that global open science commons. And then the third work package is an adoption plan. So Karen Payne from the Ocean Networks Canada and World Data Systems International Technology Office and myself are co-chairing the benchmarking working group. And there's a number, 5 or 6 colleagues that are co-chairing the interest group. So again, a link to that, the benchmarking working group documents. The proposed timeline, the other thing that distinguishes an RDA working group is a timeline, typically 18 months. And within that 18 months, that working group is asked to complete their deliverables. So this is the timeline that we're looking at for the benchmarking working group. So the "you are here" stamp refers to the upcoming RDA 17, plenary 17 in April, which is the point where the gathered colleagues will start to roll their sleeves up and work in earnest on what all of this means. And then carrying through and hoping to have a final output by November of next year. And a number of additional milestones, including, for example, the creation of a first draft of the benchmarks. So that effort will get underway in earnest around the 17th plenary, which in normal times would have taken place in the wonderful city of Edinburgh in April. Because of, for obvious reasons, it's going to be a virtual plenary this year, April 20th to 23rd. And both the GORC, IG, and benchmarking working group have sessions planned. We don't yet know the schedule, but there's a link for those that want to register. The other thing that I would say about this is there are other initiatives underway that are looking at working in a complementary fashion to the Global Open Research Commons efforts, and maybe initially confusingly called the Global Open Science Cloud. This is an effort largely stewarded by CODATA, which David referred to earlier. So whereas the RDA effort is looking at defining the kind of parameters of what it means to have an open research commons and to be a participant in that as a research infrastructure, and defining the kind of rules of engagement and the functional layers, the Global Open Science Cloud is looking at particular pilot implementations and what it would mean for an existing infrastructure. It could be something that already operates in a multinational context, like the European Open Science Cloud. There's another emerging research platform or environment coming out of Europe called Gaia X. And Gaia X is one of the defining differences between Gaia X and EOSC is that Gaia X includes commercial partnerships from the outset, whereas the European Open Science Cloud does not. So that co-data-led effort will look at areas of interoperability, including those 4 kind of high-level lenses through which to consider interoperability. There's currently a symposium being in the planning stages for later this year. So that would be the first effort to have a focused meeting to discuss elements of a global open science cloud or research commons. And that is also one of the key participants in the GEOSC effort is coming from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which has invested some funding in trying to help facilitate the conversation and understand what it means to have a globally interoperable research infrastructure. And also, I've highlighted here that the 4 organizations, I've mentioned 3 of them. The 4th is GoFair. So GoFair, together with CODATA, the Research Data Alliance, and the World Data System, have come together in a kind of a loose coalition called Data Together. And the intention of that loose coalition is to further collaborate and facilitate efforts like this Global Open Research Commons / Science Cloud and prevent duplication of effort as we go forward with that discussion. So that's pretty much all I had in the way of a discussion of this kind of emerging open research commons. There's quite a lot of emerging work happening. I would say one of the more substantial efforts at defining a national research commons, if you will, has happened in Australia. The Australian Research Data Commons has long facilitated funding and activities around building an Australian, if you will, open science cloud or open research commons. There are other examples. EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, is an obvious one. There are some very nascent efforts like the African Open Science Cloud, which is just kind of getting underway. So I think for me, I call this the emerging open research commons because with the exception of some very specific domain-specific research infrastructures, such as high energy physics, which has a very robust and well-defined kind of global infrastructure where data is passed around globally and the results of outputs are shared in an appropriate way. So there certainly are a few domain-specific examples, but when you consider the great challenges of the day, whether it's a pandemic like COVID-19, climate change, all of those challenges speak to the need to have a more globally interoperable set of research infrastructures. So that's the goal of these efforts. And I think as Andrea defines its services and moves forward with the details, my hope is that it will ensure a leadership role for Canada in this conversation about globally interoperable research infrastructures. And just a final comment for those that that may want to take a look. To my mind, an example of another global open research commons, and Karen Payne was the first person who highlighted this for me, is Microsoft's Planetary Computer. It's what it's called. I don't have a link here, but if you just Google Microsoft Planetary Computer, I think you'll see a very expected, polished presentation and a web page about what it means to have a planetary computer. But I think if you look at the examples Karen's provided in the chat, I think you'll start to get a sense of what the intention is of this group of international colleagues who are trying to define and refine what it means to have a global research infrastructure. So with that, I will close. I'll stop my share. David, I haven't really been looking at the chat, so I don't know if there's specific questions or comments, but I can.
Yeah, there are. It's a really nice question that Philippe has asked in about 9:35. If you're scrolling back, and it was the question about the language used in publications and in repositories being predominantly English, and what happens with research that's done in other languages, whether or not that sort of gets stranded. There's actually another parallel issue there you might have also a view about, which is whether or not the use of a single or a couple prevailing languages for Open Research Commons actually has a driver effect on what publications do get counted. And I recall an incident, must have been at least 10, maybe 15 years ago, where I was asked to participate in as an international advisor on the graduate funding program review in the Netherlands. And it was for Wageningen University, and we were looking at how well they were able to access funds for student placements for PhD programs, and what the academic units were doing to get prepared to really be competitive. And part of it was their bibliometrics. Mm-hmm. And the rector of the university came to our opening session with all of the reviewers and international advisors and said, don't send to me a report that involves any kind of a statement along the lines that there should be a balance between English language publications and publications in Dutch. He said, don't send that to me, because I'll send it right back to you, because the only name of the game here is research competitiveness, and we're counting English language publications only. And of course, the Dutch rural sociologists fell out of their chairs because they knew that their most salient audience from their perspective were actually native Dutch speakers and users of that kind of research. So there's a question here, I think, that's both like what gets excluded, but also how does it act as a driver if we're not careful, and are there some things that we can actually do to rectify that situation in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly, I think there are probably a few people that would argue with the current position that we find ourselves in, which is the tendency to say that the language of science globally is English. So with that kind of general traditional statement aside, I think Felipe highlights a very important aspect of those research publications that are published in other languages, and there is a lot of them. Every country, every society within a particular domain in a language context typically has its own scholarly journal. So I think for me, it's just another example of how can we transform the scholarly publishing ecosystem to allow or facilitate conversations in the language of choice, but bring that research and information to light to all researchers. And if we cast our mind to the number of times we use Google Translate to do a quick translation, or use the newer automatic browser offering to translate the page you've landed on because it's not your system language, I think points to an opportunity to use the combination of AI that typically sits under these translation engines and the dysfunctionality we have with a closed scholarly ecosystem, with the exception of the large volume of preprints, if all of the scholarly literature was accessible and could be harvested into something like a language translation AI engine, then I think our ability to do that kind of on-the-fly translation of research and specific research outputs would be hugely beneficial. And as Felipe suggests, we'd find a lot of gems in the history of research that either have been duplicated many times because it wasn't in the language of choice, or
yeah, so that could be part of the user interface, essentially, to set up a filter. Yeah, okay. Another observation along the way that at least I personally find interesting, you might have some comments about it, that came from Peter, who was saying, well, it all, a lot of this depends on how you conceive of a commons in the first place. So I guess there's a bit of a plea there for definitional clarity. So there's a contrast there between, the way that people can actually come together to work on mutualized problems and develop standards for a community, which I would characterize as being a little bit like Elinor Ostrom's kind of approach, versus a commons, which is just it's a stratified thing basically on rights and privileges, which resembles a little bit more, an intellectual property, a system organized around intellectual property constraints or principles. So I was just wondering, you've obviously, as not only in the open science, open data context, but antecedent to that in libraries, would have thought a tremendous amount about this sort of thing. So what do you think about that kind of need for definitional clarity, and which way do you go?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly thought about the idea of the commons for my entire career, whether it's the commons in the open source context or data or other contexts. For me, a very interesting newer way to think about the commons, and Peter refers to kind of, it needs an overlord or some form of hierarchy. And I think if you were to do some homework and look at Tim Berners-Lee, Tim Berners-Lee is now, I think he has come up with three what I call punctuated equilibrium moments in the history, in our digital history. The first one was, of course, the web. The second one was the semantic web, which we still have to some degree failed to fully take advantage of. And the third is something that has manifested in an idea called solid. And this is a more recent attempt by Tim Berners-Lee to define a digital ecosystem where the Facebooks and the commercial publishers, or whatever your kind of entity you want to think of, no longer control the access to or right to access or the definition of a data set or a kernel of information, but it's rather the creator of that. So if you think of, and he associates this concept of a pod, which is a personal data space, if you will. So as a researcher, as I do my research, I may choose to make the individual data sets that I create available through my solid infrastructure the moment I create it. Or I may say, at this point in time, I'm going to make this data set available, or point to the preprint that I've made. So it's the individual researcher that controls their research assets, which I think is, many people would agree, is an important part of changing the culture. So then that research commons becomes more like the town commons, or when we go to the farmer's market, where each individual producer has control over what they grow and what they charge for it and all the rest of that, whether they give it away for free. So I think our current digital infrastructure does not lend itself well to the idea of an open research commons. So I think there has to be some way of transforming that along the lines of Tim Berners-Lee's latest ideas, maybe together with a blockchain type of concept that facilitates knowing where something has come from and if somebody has transformed it.
Interesting. It's the new fair. It sounds like a medieval farm fair.
It's an interesting idea.
It is an interesting idea. Matt had a comment about just, the issue about data privacy, saying that it's coming up as a challenging to successfully implementing a global data commons, saying that it's increasingly a hurdle for the granting agencies and amongst agencies and probably also researchers. So, the Global Open Research Commons is moving in one direction, but there may be channels and emerging where you actually have quite a bit of movement towards data protection, data privacy, various kinds of assertions of sovereignty. So how do you think that's going to play out? Is it something we just need to respect and acknowledge, or do we need to actually actively work against it to mitigate the effects?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, we only, and I'm blanking on the name, somebody will put it in chat. We only need to turn ourselves to the example of the Russian colleague who trawled all of the different journal sites and created the open, it's not ResearchGate. So, when people are faced with brick walls and obstruction to doing the effective research that they want to undertake, they will find ways around it. So I think that idea of, that Barlow came up with many years ago about data wants to be free is trite, but at the same time, in the digital context, is quite true. It's hard to control those things ultimately. In addition to being a copyright officer for 20 years, I was also a privacy officer. And in my experience, the desire to not disclose data often led to privacy legislation being used as the ultimate excuse for not disclosing that data. When in very few, in almost all the cases that I ever dealt with, the information should have been disclosed or should have been released. There was no reason not to. So I think sometimes privacy, including data privacy, gets in the way of the ultimate goal of making research known. So there isn't a research project, unless it's really under the table, that should not be publicly known through a metadata description of that research. So surely there, any publicly funded research project can describe what it's doing through metadata, and that should be publicly accessible. Whether or not, even with human-focused health data, ultimately a lot of that, if not most of that data, can be released in some kind of anonymized or de-identified form. So I think the steps that we can take to have a truly open research commons, at the end of the day, I'm not so sure privacy is the big issue, because as somebody who has family members who have been part of health research projects, one of the first questions they get asked is, can we, make use of your data and share your data with our other researchers around the world? And the answer is always, of course you can. Why would I object to improving the health challenge I have by you and your research colleagues having access to data, under appropriate conditions? So
yeah,
I'm not sure if that answered Matthew's question, but
well, I think you added a lot of nuance to it. I mean, where I was also thinking was that I don't know if it's a privacy issue, but sometimes it's a proprietary issue, and there are lots of cases where you can have data which is at the same time that it's proprietary, it's used, but the domains and types of uses are restricted. We see this all the time with collaborative research.
And even I think Matthew's example of privacy getting in the way of true international collaboration. I think if you look closely at the GDPR regulations, the most important part of the regulations from a researcher perspective that I find very few people know about is the exceptions that are made under the GDPR for research. And the exceptions almost always apply to human-based research. And essentially what the GDPR regulations say is a researcher that is doing research for the public good does not need to seek the same level of consent that a private company does in order to make use of your personal information.
Right.
So the European Union, I think, has gone a long way forward, and where countries like Canada have a huge number of steps to take before we can come up to that same bar of facilitating research despite what privacy demands of the organizations and researchers that are doing that.
Right. I have a quick question for you, just logistically. Did you want to finish at the top of the hour? Because you started early, so I don't know how long you wanted to go for.
We can probably, we're due to go to 1:15.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's other kind of critical questions or comments people want to make, then we can go ahead. Otherwise, I can introduce the next breakout.
Well, why don't you, Graham's put an interesting comment there in the chat, which is, why don't we conclude with your remarks on this one, which is to think not only about linguistic and national boundaries, but just organizing something like an open research commons across disciplines. You know, if they start off being geared towards STEM, and we're thinking about open science in a STEM, limited STEM definition, as opposed to the more comprehensive ciencia kind of knowledge European approach to the term, you know, we might end up with a differently structured commons than we would for more inclusive look at research and scholarly output that not only includes STEM, but also humanities, social sciences, and creative enterprise as well within, to characterize all of that as research. So what do you think about that in terms of architecting a system that doesn't end up actually becoming sort of hamstrung by its own inbuilt predilections towards working with some disciplines as opposed to others?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. I sometimes describe the efforts we make to create national research discovery portals, and the great discovery layer that sits on top of the FRDR, the Federated Research Data Repository, is a great example. The only way to achieve that kind of cross-disciplinary search, and even in some of the journal article databases, is by dumbing the metadata up or down, however you want to think about it, to 5 or 6 common fields, whether it's author, title, keywords, those kinds of things. So I think our tools have advanced far enough that if we were to take the very detailed metadata that comes with the typical physics experiment or biodiversity species record or any of those kinds of things, there is a well-formed, generally accepted best practice for describing that with rich metadata. And I think, I tend to think of a semantic engine that is able to take those disparate disciplinary metadata records and convert them into an effective search interface that allows you to kind of get into the information you're looking for. But once you get at that level, then it somehow surfaces the detailed domain-specific metadata in the very same search engine that allows you to get more specific about certain kind of experimental parameters or types of aspects of different species. So I think the technology is mature. Our ability to see beyond the domains, and I think this is where the expertise of librarians, in particular in data scientists, becomes extremely important, is how do we take that rich metadata ecosystem and turn it to our advantage in terms of a richer discovery that respects the detail that's in those disciplines. That's one. I'm just looking at some of the other. It's interesting that Karen mentioned one of the reasons why those AI engines are so good is because of the early Canadian, the Hansard, the French English care and attention that over the decades went into creating the Parliament's Hansard reports are an important part of that. Kevin provides a link to the UNESCO document. Sci-Hub. Andrew, is that the one I was mentioning about the Russian Sci-Hub? I think that's the Russian way to get access to a lot of the literature. Oh, and then I see, David, the question from Graham about the other national boundaries and the like. Brian's comment about the GDPR. I mean, I've been saying for years to Canadian colleagues, if we just really closely looked at their GDPR, we would be shocked at how sensible it is. Rather than, this provincial, every province has its own privacy legislation that goes to the, ridiculous sometimes degrees in terms of the data can't leave the province, which in a digital context is a nonsensical idea. Very, very much worth looking at. So I don't see any other specific items there. So it looks like we're probably good to go. Funny historical fact, when I worked for a CD-ROM company in Ottawa, I won't say how long ago, one of our very first projects was a pilot CD of the Hansard, and the contract we had with the Parliament was to determine the most effective way to digitize the Hansard. Was it a scanning operation or sending the print volumes to the Philippines to be double keyed by typists? So we actually had a pilot project where we did both and looked at the quality of the output. And at that time, we found that the double keyed entry from a well-considered operation in the Philippines was the most accurate output, but way too expensive. So we ended up doing a scanning thing to put the Hansards on CD. And then 20 years later, I got a phone call from the head of the Library of Parliament asking if there was any way to get their data out of that old CD. So a good example of digital technology that wasn't useful after its time had come. Okay, I'm going to, thanks David, and thanks for the questions, comments. There's lots of additional bits of information in the chat there. So I am just going to say a few words about the next breakout. Okay, so the next breakout, and many thanks to those colleagues that have stuck through to day 3. As I said, it's sometimes a challenge when you're working in a virtual context to not be distracted by other work and personal activities, so I appreciate that. So just to highlight where we are. So breakout 5 is the opportunity. There's no more questions to probe discussion and derive statements. This is the opportunity to complete your discussion and kind of go through your notes if needed, and provide the statements that the note takers would then add to the upvoting tool. I know there's at least one, so I would encourage folks to, if your moderator or note taker has had to step away, I know there's 1 or 2 cases where that's happened, and it's hard to kind of bring a pinch hitter in late in the day. So if folks from those groups are able to come together to put the statements into the upvote tool, then that would be great. I went through this yesterday, so I won't go into detail, but ultimately our goal is to take a look at the statements that are there. Each attendee can vote a particular suggestion up only once. The system uses cookies to determine whether or not you've already upvoted that, so you don't get a chance to do it more than once. But feel free to upvote up to 10 of the statements that you will see in the tool as they emerge. And when you log in as a regular user, as opposed to a note taker or moderator, you will see something that looks like this. So you can click that big green upvote button, and that's how you do it. And if you want, you can add a comment, which is always useful if you have some additional context you want to add. And as I said yesterday, all of this work that people are putting into this effort will get rolled up into a summary output that will be circulated publicly, hopefully within the next 6 weeks. And there's the link. It's also in your shared documents. I will just leave it on that slide for now. And ask if there's any questions in terms of next steps, because if there's not, then people will be able to go back into your breakouts. If you don't remember your breakout, you can always ask the technical support user in the chat, or just put your message in the chat generally if you're not sure how to pick a user, and we'll help you get where you need to go. Otherwise, we will see you back. Just get to my other slide here. So it's close to 1:15, so we're kind of back on our original timeline. We're a little bit early. We're about 15, 20 minutes early. So feel free to go into your breakouts. As for the last 2 days, that half-hour break is for you to do as you need to. We're going to return everybody, close the breakouts rooms at 2:30 to come back. And hopefully you will have been able to volunteer somebody from your group, or the moderators will do it, to just provide some comments, context, other bits of feedback on their discussions, and then we'll have a wrap up. All right, thanks everyone. All right, so we'll go ahead and see if we can, as I said, maybe give people an opportunity to finish up a little sooner. I noticed that we have, and I will share my browser screen with their upvoting tool once the reporting is done, or maybe I'll switch to that once people start. But I see we have 102 suggestions so far in the tool, so that's good. And some people are starting to upvote, so also good. So summit reporting, and again, you highlight the key statements you pulled out. Any other comments you have, it's your opportunity to kind of report on behalf of your cohort. So while Felicity, if you're can unmute yourself, or if you're unmuted, then I'll let you start, and I'm going to change my screen share to the upvote tool.
Okay, I unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Is there like a timer that rings at the end of my time?
I'll give you I will start a timer. 4 minutes. I'll give you
I don't know. Okay, so I'm just gonna promote the ideas that we put into the upvote tool in reverse order of which ones our group liked the most. So so you can look for them in the upvote tool. So the first one is publishers can be your friends, which is, once we all got over the idea of like the big predatory publishers and the commercial publishers that sort of loom large, we started to talk about how the publishers are well connected to the communities that they serve, and can be used as, as a mechanism to spread, encourage, or enforce good data management and research software registration practices that maybe have developed in existing or new communities of practice. They also have many incentives that can be used to encourage particular behaviors, such as good data management practices and software registration. And they're also major players in promotion and tenure processes, and we can leverage this position to drive desired outcomes. We also talked about how we need to design our metrics to favor desired data behaviors. And the existing metrics favor tenured academics, but early career researchers are more likely to undertake desired data sharing behaviors and can foster these behaviors within their organizations. How about metrics and support that incentivize desirable behaviors in the next generation of tenured academics? We also think it's a good idea to design and implement impact factors for data. So granting agencies should ensure that data sharing be rewarded in a similar way as scholarly publications, but we also need to avoid the recognized problems of impact factors for papers, or journal articles. If this were to be true, it would become valuable for tenure and grant applications. And we need to invest in specialized support for long-tailed research, in expertise, infrastructure, and systems. Investments need to be made in specialized support for long tail and small community research to ensure that the needs of the large and the few do not determine infrastructure provision. This would center the needs of areas like humanities and social science research and Indigenous data sovereignty. And these communities require extensive HQP support, much more than other disciplines, working with large volumes of relatively homogeneous data formats and computational methodologies. We also want to drive end-to-end solution design and provision across all the 3 pillars. And here we had a big debate about whether we want to amalgamate the 3 pillars, consolidate the 3 pillars, or whether we just want to encourage integration, but still kind of recognize 3 pillars. We came up with, we want an end-to-end solution design across the pillars. And this requires an integrated approach. Infrastructure provision needs to recognize the interdependencies between the 3 pillars. So advanced software is needed to process the data. Compute services are needed to run the software. And the strategy needs to be done at a whole or an organizational level, not pillar level. And operations need to be integrated. And finally, NGO should establish a research service provider advisory committee. So this should be established to agree on services and service delivery approaches that would benefit from a cross-sectorial approach to governance. To increase the diversity of inputs, it would be great to have as many links out as possible with multiple transparent mechanisms for engagement and effective working relationships with the service provider communities.
Awesome. You were so efficient, you didn't give me a chance to let everybody hear the 4-minute timer bell.
Well.
So thanks, Felicity. Good example of some nice actionable statements as well. Karen, I think you're next.
Yep. Yeah, I'm reporting for Group I. We had 10 statements coming out. In the first breakout that was focused on governance, we recognized that identification was the first service that's going to be required for integrating any of the research artifacts that are created. And so we wanted NGO in conjunction with colleges and universities to either promote or ideally require the use of PIDs for researchers, publications, data, and funding. We saw those 4 as the first step. And then NGO should decide which PID providers were appropriate in the Canadian context that wouldn't lead to vendor lock-in. So not necessarily open source, but certainly open standards. NGO can identify key metrics to help institutions monitor and evaluate DMP performance across funded projects. Metadata, PIDs, and semantics, we saw them as 3 key services for reproducible research. And we thought it would be helpful to have NGO fund sandbox or exemplar projects that show how, across the set of domains, about how they use disaggregated services for metadata, PIDs, and semantics to create a reproducible research project. And then we thought NGO should convene a high-level panel designed to create recommendations for funders and research institutions, including VPRs and their staff, that ensure primary producers are rewarded and not exploited by either non-contributing predators, whether they be state or non-state nefarious actors or commercial actors. From breakout 2, we saw that the addition of data management activities as being an additional burden on researchers. And I think Felicity just remarked on that. And so funders could require a full-time data manager for each funded project. And though we saw a lot of flexibility in where that service could come from, the data manager could be either embedded in a larger project management role in the research team from library services, provided by research services, or be an independent contractor. But that NGO should provide guidelines on how many projects a single data manager can accommodate, so that they don't also get overburdened as well. And that should be a recognition that the resources might be needed for the smaller institutions, research institutions. In the breakout 3 on communications, and my guess is NGO is already doing this, that they should create a communication channel that people can connect to with a director of communications across all types of platforms, social media, listservs, and email, in addition to hosting an event once or twice a year, perhaps once in person and once virtual. And that we saw that that communication channel should be both domestic and international. So they should be outwardly facing, for example, with the International Science Council has a new call out for international science communications networks. NGO should identify the appropriate stakeholders that should be involved in RDM communication channels and assign a dedicated NGO contact for that purpose on each campus. And there is a need for NGO to engage with key executive personnel at the VPR level to communicate the importance of RDM practices within the institutions. And finally, in breakout 4, we saw the importance of PIDs and that the inability to separate PIDs from metrics. And so we believe that federal research agencies could require researchers to have an ORCID ID or equivalent if it was shown to be interoperable. Each data set a DOI, each research reward a funder reference. NGO could help shape the policies and best practices for those consistent use of PIDs. And finally, NGO and other funders could mandate that the institutions receiving funds ensure recognition and reward for researchers for making their data and other research artifacts available. It would also be helpful if they could create a dashboard with data visualization of performance metrics that reflect good RDM practices across their funded bodies. That's it.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Karen and Team I. Brian, I think you're next for H.
Sounds good. You can hear me, I assume?
Yep.
So this is my summary. So I apologize if I misrepresent anything from my group. We produced a lot of statements, and I'm going to kind of do a high-level summary of some of the key ones, I think. So one of our breakouts was around data ownership, and we decided that data ownership was very complex. There are many types of ownership. Stewardship and responsibility changes over time. So one of the things that we suggested was that the community maybe needs to be a little bit more refined in having a consensus statement on what ownership of data means and what the responsibilities for different stakeholders and owners are at different points of time. I think that's a really complex question. One of our breakouts was around policy, and our stakeholders was for researchers. So one of the key things there that we pulled out was that I think probably most of us would agree that researchers need policies that encourage data sharing and reuse. In terms of service providers, it's important that they provide and support researchers in managing research data through clear policies as well, so that researchers can determine the right way to share their data. And so those policies are really important. I think one of the key kind of high-level outcomes of our discussion was really around that policies aren't very useful without resources to deliver on the implementation of those policies. And so we thought that it was really important that service providers also need to provide resources such that they can support the researchers in instituting those policies. So organizations like the institutions and NGO should have policies on data sharing and how they support data sharing, but they also need to ensure that they have the resources to support the implementation of those policies. Another breakout we had was around data deposit, our stakeholder for publishers and communities of practice. I think probably there's general consensus that publishers and communities of practice should encourage and support fair, care, and OCAP principles. But I think the thing that we teased out on this one is that stakeholders, these two stakeholders do this in very different ways. So clearly publishers should encourage and support all aspects of data deposit, social communities of practice, but the communities of practice are setting standards on how that data should be deposited and stored, and the publishers should not. And so those two stakeholders were grouped together for us. But I think the kind of the way they would support data deposit is quite different. And our last breakout was around international partnership for infrastructure providers. And the key statement I pulled out for that one was that we think the infrastructure providers, whether they be institutions or NGO, they need to create venues so that national, international dialogues regarding data sharing that span the multiple stakeholders, researchers, funders, and institutions. So those venues for having those discussions are really, really important, in particular around international partnership and having Canada be a player at the international level in research data management. That's it.
All right, thanks, Brian. Everybody's doing so well staying on time, and I meant to just kind of pull out a thread on each one, but maybe I'll just do a couple that were common, mentioning the important role publishers play. And I think for many of us, the publishers' participation in the conversation comes forward in different ways. But I did want to highlight that one of our colleagues taking part in the summit is here from the Canadian Science Publishing, which to my mind is an exemplar of a publisher that's kind of trying to transition, number one, produce a very high quality print and digital product, but also looking at ways to transition into that more open ecosystem. So wanted to acknowledge that. And on Brian's trying to figure out what data ownership means, part of me wants to suggest the context obviously is very different, but one thing I like about the OCAP principles and the CARE principles is our colleagues in the various Indigenous communities don't really have a term ownership or don't use that term. So I think when we think about ownership and how to put that in a context of data, I think all of us should have a look at the OCAP and CARE and similar principles to see how they talk about the meaning of data in their communities. Doug, I think you're next for Group G.
I am. So our first breakout was focused on international partnerships, specifically in connection with publishers and communities of practice. What we came up with were that we need to create new mechanisms, and that could be tools or resources or a subgroup to facilitate communication between Canadian researchers, publishers, and repositories. And that's meant to fit into the broader international landscape, those discussions, and for interchange of ideas and developments and adoption of standards, and leveraging existing tools and communities. The communities of practice and disciplines, in many cases, are already international. And so if you want to move up to the international level, that's one way to do that. In the Pechakucha session, that was the escalator image, move up to move down, up towards the communities of practice and then down and towards the members. This also ties into next generation of researchers and some of that discussion around are we sort of trying to do some social engineering in the research landscape. So it ties in there. A second outcome would be that we need to develop an international strategy and have some representation in international organizations for building out and continuing to contribute to those partnerships and to really build on the excellent reputation Canada has in that area. So we've done very well so far and you need to build that out further. Our second breakout was around deposits, specifically in the context for researchers. What we suggested was that we need to educate researchers and create resources for them to articulate and identify common practices across repositories. So to try to put information in front of them early on in a consistent messaging way about sort of what needs to happen and what the benefits are there. Maybe trying to build out data champions within the research community within institutions and beyond. I think one of the images we had was trying to, these discussions are happening in corners of organizations sometimes, sort of need to get the data champions out into the middle of the dance floor and sort of get away from the corners a little bit. I think that's probably happening, but really trying to facilitate that. Also to incentivize research data management and data sharing. This also goes back to the larger academic economic ecosystem around promotion and tenure, how funding works, what's recognized and what's advanced. So really trying to encourage people to deposit the data and manage it properly, and that has to be worth their while. Then it's not just an add-on to what it is they're doing or just seen as an additional burden. Our third breakout is policy, specifically around infrastructure providers. So what we suggested there was develop or leverage existing DMP type tools to help researchers and institutions understand a full data management lifecycle. So the idea there is that trying to lay out for people what a complete holistic lifecycle might look like, all the bits and pieces, and that's also meant to help them estimate some costs or get a sense of costing, especially if that's going to get built into funding requests to also show them what the whole landscape looks like. Also, some national policy recommendations to identify desired levels of RDM capacity in all different areas with gaps and needs. One that came up around PIDs that was a very interesting discussion was about proactively and holistically planning for the long-term preservation and sustainability, both of PID issuing and managing organizations, but of the data that they manage and issue. So if we think about sort of risk mitigation, disaster management, if a pillar cracks, your whole temple is going to come down. Right, so that's probably not it's a very, I apologize, engineers, I really do, but I think that's typically what happens. It's not a good move, so try to make sure that we're very intentional around making sure that those pillars don't crack, that they stay strong. And some developing a robust policy language for data sovereignty for Indigenous communities, also respecting Mark's comments about how those groups may view ownership differently. Finally, we talked about data ownership, as it turns out, from the researcher's perspective. One that we thought was important was to fill infrastructure gaps that hamper the ability of Indigenous groups to participate fully in the research enterprise, to really build full partners. So that could be connectivity, co-location of data. That's also around data sovereignty, infrastructure capacity, identity management systems, how they can actually interact with the systems we operate. Those are also those are closed systems and trying to address some of that. Again, requiring OCAP training for researchers. It becomes part of what you do now as a modern researcher. It's just built into research ethics, and that's just part of graduate and professional education. Supporting data sovereignty of the Indigenous communities within the research ecosystem. That could be coming out of care principles, maybe promoting the use of things like TK labels to indicate some traditional knowledge tags around specific data components. And then finally, leveraging a working group to provide professional advice regarding really extraordinary issues for sensitive data handling. So in the areas of data curation, access and control rights for researchers, specifically around, well, all sensitive data, but Indigenous groups in particular. That's Group G.
All right, thanks, Doug. Great discussion. The one thread I would pull out a little bit there, partly because my colleague Matthew Lucasen, Matthew's at Shirk, and I have discussed this idea of data champions. It's one that we both quite like as a way to kind of build capacity at the organizational level and within the disciplines. So I hope we see some kind of opportunity to facilitate that with some incentives for folks to play that role down the way. Murray, Group F. There we go.
So I apologize that ours aren't currently tagged, but anything that's under Mari Best is from cohort F, and I'll work on tagging them, etc. But we were down to the wire and we didn't actually have a note taker. So thanks to everybody who stepped up to the plate to help with that. So I'm going to just run through from breakout 1 to 4. We have 3 outcomes in each case. So the first one was in terms of research data management. and how that would best intersect with the evolution of RDM services over the next 1 to 3 years. So theme was sustainability, and stakeholder was funders. So our recommendations are fund long-term data storage and preservation. In other words, funders need to support national storage and long-term preservation options that meet the gaps, and particularly in terms of sensitive data and long-term storage and so on, and support for HQP that can help in this process. Funders specify RDM requirements, research data management requirements, exemplify best practices, and reward those who meet the requirements. Funders also should create a level playing field for institutions regarding sustainability of data. And I think that's a really good point. And we had a good group that, spanned a whole range of sizes and sort of levels of resources of the institutions. For breakout 2, these are the intersections of the 3 pillars. Theme was metadata and stakeholders, funders. Funders need to encourage and fund better metadata practices and documentation practices. Funders should require greater metadata integration into their tools and efforts. So, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And work with institutions and organizations and really keep a finger on what are becoming the international standards, and help everybody migrate to those as easily as possible, and not make us all, as I have certainly through my career, repopulate various versions of common CVs. There must be at least half a dozen versions of that I've had to repopulate from scratch. Hopefully this is improving, but this is something that we need to really pay attention to, and understand that this also includes, part of it is the automatic population of things. So integrate existing metadata technologies more deeply into sort of funding strategies, and help use the power of particularly the technologies, so that people don't have to be manually repopulating things. Cybersecurity also can be strengthened by this, particularly with sort of PID application when it comes to researcher IDs, and sort of applications of common sign-in protocols. Breakout 3, intersections with national framework, regional protocols for data sovereignty, and not international ecosystems. This is close to my heart, having worked in Europe for the past decade. The theme was security and privacy, and stakeholders, publishers, and communities of practice. And inevitably across the research landscape, our reality, even though we're talking about national approaches and facilities, we're working in an international context, and we should always keep that in mind. So recommendations are develop comprehensive non-prescriptive tools to enable researchers to support domain-specific needs. Communities of practice informed training of researchers, research support staff, and research offices. And that the support is there for appropriate tools and techniques to ensure security and privacy of data. The publishers and communities of practice encourage metadata sharing for data that cannot be made public. And so the data doesn't necessarily have to be shared, but the metadata should be facilitated to be shared.
We're a little over time there, Murray, so I don't know if you have many left, but.
Well, there's breakout 4, and I'll try and go quickly. So this is Indigenous data sovereignty and infrastructure providers, support local training and capacity building for local Indigenous communities, support infrastructure training, capacity building with respect to distinctions based on Indigenous data sovereignty, you know, basically from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives, and build relationships with Indigenous nations communities to foster Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's it.
Okay, thanks,
Thanks,
Mark.
Mark.
And I'll just, Mari referred to not doing the tagging. I wouldn't worry about the tagging at all. I realized, I'm not quite sure how that happened, but some of you creative souls have managed to, instead of choosing a breakout tag, an under consideration tag, which is fine. I've modified the back end so that under consideration will show up now if you click on the all tab to pick a breakout. So under consideration is also there. So tagging it as to whether it's breakout 1, 2, or 3 is more a convenience for folks as they're uploading. So I wouldn't worry about the tagging at all.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
Okay.
That does make it easier.
And Shahira's next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to thank all of our group members. We had a really great set of members contributing to good discussions over the past 3 days. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the key points that made it into the upvoting tool. So our first topic was around sustainability of infrastructure, and our conversations started around funding cycles. So providing infrastructure providers access to funding models that support longer term initiatives, so both capital and operating costs. As well, funding models at the moment can be isolated, and so there's a role for organizations like NGO to bring funders and infrastructure providers together, and that can support greater impact and longer term sustainability. Also, funding models that allow infrastructure providers to spend money strategically according to needs of researchers rather than just according to the funding cycle. So having some flexibility in there. And also in terms of supporting infrastructure providers, there's a role for data management plans and planning generally at the start of research projects to allow them to better anticipate needs throughout a research project. So for instance, embedding that sort of planning into the funding application. What else? In terms of sustainability as well, we talked about the preferred use of open tools and platforms, and then also adopting international best practices and models rather than creating new challenges for ourselves, so learning from what exists. The next set of discussions was around supporting researchers with improvements to metadata. So we started off talking about the value of persistent identifiers for data objects and for authors and institutions, and then the need for integrations within infrastructure as well. And then the rest of those discussions were around supporting researchers through training and consultation. So service providers should be offering early consultations with research teams so that they can learn about the importance of metadata and develop a strategy for collecting it throughout their projects. And there's roles, a couple of roles that we talked about were research facilitators that could be assigned to research groups to help the kind of coordination piece between services, tools, and research. And we also talked about the need for continuous iterative training rather than having researchers receive training at the start of a funded project and then forgetting all of that by the time they make it to their next project, providing access to training continuously that they can take advantage of to build their skills over time so that they're not lost from one project to the next. The next set of questions were around support and infrastructure for sensitive data and how to build trust between infrastructure providers and researchers. One key consideration was certification as a clear way for researchers to have trust within infrastructure if they're working with sensitive data. Infrastructure providers should also be providing, again, continuous training to researchers so that they understand how infrastructure works and how to use it securely. And then in terms of the infrastructure needed for sensitive data, being able to, or offering stratified layers of security that can accommodate different levels of access based on sensitivity of the data. And then another role in that situation would be, again, kind of a liaison or facilitator role that can mediate researcher needs and then infrastructure realities, if you will. And then our last set of discussions were around Indigenous data sovereignty. And fundamentally, we talked about how all of that work needs to be grounded within authentic, trusted relationships in order to actually build useful, culturally sensitive supports and guidance. And our Indigenous colleagues need to be provided with flexible opportunities for engagement with national initiatives so that it's up to them how and when to engage with them.
Right, that's great. Thanks, Shahira. One of the key words Shahira mentioned was a consultants or consultancy service in terms of providing researchers with help. And it reminds me of a suggestion I've made to colleagues when you're having a conversation with a researcher about data management, that you have somebody in the room that I call a DMP mole. And the DMP mole's job is to listen to the conversation, fill out the actual DMP, and then typically at the end of that conversation, or maybe a follow-up, you can present a fully filled out rich DMP to the researcher and save them the time and effort of trying to understand what all those questions mean as they go forward. So one example. Next is cohort D with Louise. Or is it Mike?
I would be excited if Louise is going to do it. That would be fantastic.
Okay. I may have noted it incorrectly. So you go ahead, Mike, if you're the designated speaker.
Summarizing on behalf of Ernie, who took our notes and made his own notes, which I am now synthesizing into my notes to you. So at the end of this long game of telephone, we have four quick pieces. The first is on the subject of training, and the idea of early training and getting that education at the student level, right? So that we're ensuring that our graduate students and research students are equipped with the skills that they need to effectively manage data. I'm excited to, of course, Ernie is a long-standing fan of the Data Liberation Initiative, and he recommended the DLI approach in terms of training and support. So having your local experts, a training Bible, a core training group, a train the trainer approach, communication, help desks, and you know, this is the Portage network is loosely based on this, and this is part of the thinking behind a national data service, but being explicit about that in terms of how people are participating in this network. And then the idea that, you know, we can't do all the training that we need, you know, on day one, like when faculty start or when graduate students start, that there's some base level of foundational training that we can provide, but then a lot of the demand is going to be just in time or when I need it. And on the one hand, that's not fair on the data providers, but that's also the reality that we'll be facing. And so preparing for that, knowing that we can do some base level in advance, but we're going to have to get more specific, kind of in a unpredictable, on demand, just in time moment. Before you know where you want to go with your planning, you need to know where you're at. And so an honest self-assessment of your research infrastructure, perhaps using the RISE framework, is really important. And recognizing that DMPs are living documents, and that means that identifying a single checkpoint like a funding application isn't enough. There needs to be long-term and ongoing support and contact points. On the incentive side, look, we need to reward the things that we care about, and we're caring about data, and we want everyone to care about data as much as we do, and so we divided our conversation up into, you could divide our conversation up into carrots and sticks, right? So what do people want, and how can we keep it from them until they give us what we want? And that would be things like research funding, ensuring that the Canadian Common CV recognizes data as a form of publication. When assessing grant proposals, ensuring that there's expertise to undertake merit review of data management plans within the room. Institutional strategies to link with funder expectations. How we evaluate and reward good DMPs is a good question. Are there badges? Are there good policies? Are there are fees to publish articles in journals different depending on whether your data is open or not, right? There's incentive schemes that we think we could be quite creative of, going back to the previous comment about publishers, about working with publishers. And look, until we encode this kind of stuff in tenure and promotion policies at institutional levels, a lot of our incentives aren't going to be in place, at least on the university side. And so switching to this idea of public good, there is a culture shift that needs to take place. And so as we continue to shape what we value through our policies and actions, we need policies and guidelines that support PIDs, that enhance this idea of data deposit and publications, and also focusing on the willing, right? Like you can get a long way by figuring out what can be shared without compromising what researchers are concerned about, without worrying about getting every single last scrap of data, right? Like let's do the things that I think we're past low-hanging fruit now, but the next level of fruit on the tree is a valuable next step. And of course, always for the public good, we need resources, right? The researchers aren't a lot of researchers aren't completely unwilling to do this. It's a time and resource thing, and ensuring that they have access to those times and resources is a very useful thing.
Thanks, Mike. And Group D, it's a lot of interesting threads there. But I mean, for me, the keyword that stuck out was the link back to promotion and tenure, and the need to have that as a critical part of the culture change piece. So thanks for that. Barton, cohort C.
Righto. So cohort C spent our time going over the discussions of the last couple of days and trying to pull out some threads and turn them into concrete, actionable things that we could suggest and put them into the upvote tool. So let me just find them here. So one simple thing, suggestion that came out is that publishers should mandate that data availability statements be available. And going a little bit further, actually require reasons if data cannot be provided. Another suggestion that came up is to create a community of practice around infrastructure development and, importantly, reuse. And we spend a lot of time talking about encouraging good social behavior. We use the example of tools like GitHub that, in a very passive way, not through heavy rules and requirements or things like that, but they're emerged ways of making it easy for your software project to be adopted by others. And you recognize those features and then you add them to your own project. And that's sort of taking advantage of self-interest, I suppose, where if I make it easy for you to adopt my software, my infrastructure, my data, then you win because it's easy for you to adopt it. and I win because my project is more successful and more broadly used. And so this registry could provide a set of good examples, good patterns that can be used to encourage adoption and reuse. In a somewhat similar vein, another suggestion was to create a registry of infrastructure needs that are aimed particularly at sharing infrastructure, sharing funding. The images that emerged in that conversation were things like GoFundMe projects or ride shares. And the goal is to create a registry not only of infrastructure needs, but also infrastructure that you might have that might be usable by others, which I guess is sort of like more like a dating app or a matchmaking app. And we recognize that it can sometimes be difficult for researchers to take their research funding and take whatever portion of it is available for tools and infrastructure. It would be nice if those researchers could contribute their funding to some kind of pot for the development of shared infrastructure. So again, going back to this theme of providing examples of successful projects or successful patterns, there is the suggestion that small pilot projects could be developed that demonstrate the use of technologies or systems, and have them in a discoverable in a registry. And perhaps like research projects, these projects could be pre-registered. So you could say, here's a project that we're thinking of doing. It's going to have these goals. It's going to develop these systems, and check back here in 6 months' time for the results. This would tie in with the other ideas about providing ways of recognizing things that would make it easy to adopt new systems, and encourage the collaboration and the sharing of these tools and infrastructures. Just making it easy for new things to be adopted by research projects. And I think that's the end of our.
All right, thanks, Barton. I'm going to cheat and pull on two threads there. You mentioned data availability statements, which are typically only heard or most often heard in conversations with publishers. I think it's one of the best ways to pre-engage or start a conversation with a researcher about what it means to share data. So I kudos to the publishers, and I think Canadian Science Publishing is looking at this as one of their policies, requiring researchers to create or pick their data availability statement from a list. I think is an incredibly important way to help bring researchers deeper into the conversation. We also mentioned a kind of an infrastructure registry. I know there was a couple of years ago, and Chantal was part of our group here, Chantal Ridsdale. She worked with me in the RDC context to create a registry of research data management services, equipment, resources, people, all of those things. We called it Research Link. We're hoping to kind of see that evolve and be updated with some of the information that Shahira and others are gathering in the embryo context. And its intended purpose was exactly as you suggested, kind of a dating service for researchers to find the research resources they need. Second last, Peter, you're reporting for B.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. So B was the underperformer of this this group. We've had rotating moderators and rotating participants. 3 of us showed up this morning, and we've tried a little bit to summarize what had been discussed over the various times. But the first issue that we were assigned to discuss was this idea of open science, and there were immediately there's a lot of discussion about who are the participants in open science, and does it have to be the shoulders of giants, and can smaller groups or individuals or even non-academic, non-institutionalized academics be participants in the open science? But nevertheless, we came up with some statements that we submitted for upvoting, and the first one was about the RDM services and necessary for adoption of open science practices. And we really appreciated your presentation this morning, Mark, about the PID graphs and this ability to identify persistently and versions of data and versions of descriptors of data will be very really important to make that data that's deposited timeless, because what we call one thing today, well, the words, the descriptors, the understanding of what it is that the data is about will change over time. And the first step is to have the PID graphs organized in such a way that and the services, the DRM services, will be designed to simplify and grease the ability to decorate all that data with the appropriate personal persistent identifiers. The other issue we discussed was semantic interoperability, and that word semantic, and all the different schemas and taxonomies and the languages and versions of languages. There's the small village language, there's the language of the community of practice or the designated community, and then there's the common language, the lingua franca, I guess, which are often not necessarily understandable across the different users of those languages. So that semantic interoperability has to recognize this plurality, and an important role of the research data management services is consensus building and working with different stakeholders and the plurality of stakeholders, so that not only is the interoperability interoperable between machines, but also between brains, that different perspectives, different mindsets need to somehow be accommodated. That's a big ask, but we've got 1,000 years to figure that out, I guess. The second thing, the second issue that we looked at was data reuse. One of the discussions we had this morning was this idea of designated communities need to maintain rights and sovereignty over how open data in open repositories that have been submitted by those designated committees are accessed in ways that respect the values of the communities. And we talked about Indigenous sensitivities to the sensitivities of Indigenous people about how their data or stuff about themselves or their communities are used has to be respected. So there's always going to be this this dynamic back and forth, I guess, around the the understanding of what the data means by the communities that generate it, and the understanding of what data could mean by other groups that could use it, and somehow there has to be some reach through. It can't just be CC BY, I think, and that's something that we'll have to negotiate. In the open source coding field, permissive licenses are really proliferating. There's all kinds of different ways in which permissions are tagged to licenses. And in fact, when Google accesses various types of open source tools, they only access things that have licenses that they can use in their particular model. So negotiating those licenses and crafting those licenses could be an important role of data research management services. And then reuse also has to, it's just one part of sustainable development. There's the first thing is to refuse to actually collect data that's inappropriate, then reduce the collection of data as far as possible, then reuse, and then finally recycle and repurpose. Those are all other aspects that have to be operationalized in tandem with the reuse of data. The other thing we discussed, I guess, more informally, or we didn't actually get around to creating something that can be deposited in the upvoting posting, is who is a researcher. And just like we have an ORCID ID for researchers that are associated with an academic institution, it might be possible to have some kind of either self-declaration of skills and capacities, or some way of registering people who have research skills that can allow them to to deposit data in these repositories, so that we involve all citizens of the country or polity that is supporting the public resource of that's sharing the open data.
Probably finish
okay.
up.
Yeah. So that's it. Thanks.
All right. Great. Good timing. Thank you. And our last one is Donald for Group A.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you to my colleagues from Cohort A. I kept missing portions of the working groups and the sessions, and I'm happy to report what I can on the activities of our group. I'll try to be quick. The first item was related to funder mandates and policies, and our discussion resulted in a number of recommendations that funders need to work with institutions to establish incentives and strengthen academic credit for sharing data and other research outputs openly. Funders should engage in strategic collaborations with other stakeholders, for example, to implement the kinds of mechanisms needed to ensure research data management and data sharing align with open science principles. And that funders should promote the interoperability of data through wide adoption of discipline-appropriate metadata standards and reward their use. And as an example, where appropriate, funders should require the adoption of a standard metadata schema to ensure interoperability and sharing. The next item was the role of infrastructure providers, and some of the outcomes there. Infrastructure providers should integrate data site DOIs into the data deposit process. Data needs to be reusable, identifiable, accessible from different sources. Infrastructure providers should link DMP assistant outputs, the DMPs themselves, by providing them with a persistent identifier a data site DOI, for example, ensure that they can interoperate with other platforms such as Further, Dataverse, and grant application systems. That infrastructure providers should work with institutions to incorporate ORCID into their infrastructure to ensure seamless data sharing and use by researchers, within 10 years. Oh my. Infrastructure providers should develop and implement a well-supported tool to help data creators or curators check the anonymization of a data set. That was something that was identified as being a fair amount of work for researchers sort of after the fact as their data was produced to ensure that the data was anonymized for reuse. And if there were tools to help support that work, that would be beneficial. The next one was supports for researchers or barriers to data stewardship training or education. An item here that researchers should communicate and inform in plain language details of the research process, methods, and outcomes with a non-academic community to reach a level of engagement and trust in science among the general public. Just scooting through. And I think there was also a suggestion that researchers could be supported with media training so that they are able to communicate better with diverse folks. Finally, what can researchers do to change or to engage in the development of a national data service and engage with Canadian citizens? Researchers should use, evaluate, and provide feedback on the Canadian RDM resources and tools they have access to ensure that their needs are met. So provide a continuous feedback for those providing services or tools. That researchers should be required to complete an RDM training and acquire a certificate similar to the existing requirements related to the TCPS2 training on ethics for research with human subjects, but applied instead to the research involved in collecting data. And I think that's it.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Donald. It's good to end the Group A's summary set of suggestions on the researchers should have to do achieve an RDM certificate. We'll work on that one. I'm just going to make a few general comments and then I'll open it up in case anybody wants any final words before we adjourn. So I've shared my screen with the upvote tool. You can see that there's 123 suggestions. People have started to upvote. So please feel free to go in and click the upvote button. Try to limit your upvotes to 10 separate suggestions. When you go to an item, adding your comment can be useful if you want to add additional context or enhancements, suggestions to that one. As I said, we'll keep this open till Friday. It's 123 suggestions is a lot. So folks aren't going to be able to do it before we adjourn. So that would be the key final action that I would ask you to take. Other than that, I just I know we've heard the term commons in a few different ways and contexts throughout the last 3 days. Each of us has a different vision of what it means to have a commons, whether it's in our own local physical context or in the digital context of the research landscape. So I just, I thought this was an interesting image of a commons, and in this particular case, they were painting an image of a digital commons using physical artifacts in their drawing. So all I can say is I think the commons and this emerging global open research commons, I think, is an important opportunity for Canada to show leadership, whether it's organizations like NVIO or individuals like those of you that have attended the summit. So I think, at least for me, it's always a nice lens through which to view the research landscape, that it is more of a commons than a patent database or an intellectual copyright kind of context. So I think at the very least, thinking about our research commons, our research landscape as a commons at least does help to think about what that means. Just wanted to highlight the contributions of a couple of people. Joseph and Anthony Blaine have been our interpreters, and very challenging, as you can well imagine, to listen to Pechacuchas on the fly without having any context and translate the English into French. I've been had the opportunity to partner with the Blaine organization and Joseph and Anthony and some of their colleagues in webinar interpretations, and they do a great job. So thank you to you both. Chantal and Melissa, of course, from Say Something, as our virtual conference managers, organizers, keepers of the flame, all of those kinds of things. So many thanks to Chantal and Melissa. Thanks again to the working group. I won't list them off. I had a slide earlier in one of the earlier days. It is about an 8-month timeline to kind of put the pieces in place and plan. And then there's a little bit of extra work after it's all said and done, because the working group will be asked to come back together to consider a draft summary of the summit, which I will draft up based on all of the awesome input that you have all provided. And then finally, all of you, the attendees, it's, as I said, it's not easy to give the gift of your time and your wisdom when you're working from home typically, and you have a lot of business as well as personal demands on your time. So I really do appreciate that. And with that, I would like to, I'm not sure, Chantal or Melissa, if we can open up the ability for folks to unmute themselves, but what I'm going to suggest is, if you do have any final comments, if you want to put your virtual hand up, then hopefully you can either unmute yourselves, or Chantal or Melissa will be able to do that. So any final comments before we adjourn?
Nobody else is going to weigh in. I just wanted to say thanks, Mark, for bringing everybody together. I think it was a great opportunity to share and discuss all of the different issues that were raised in the various breakouts. I'm really looking forward to you and Andrea and others wading through all of the results and getting some sense of them. I think the upcoming town halls will be another opportunity for folks to get together. The NDRIO is planning a number of town halls the week of April 19th, and I would certainly encourage all of you to look for announcements of that and opportunities to participate in both English and French at that opportunity. And circling back to Nizar's opening presentation, where he showed the org chart and data management moving into NDRIO as of April 1st. both RDC and Portage have been working hard in this space for the past number of years. And I'm just really excited as part of Portage to see a number of funded positions moving over into Andrio as of April 1st, working on a whole lot of great initiatives with many of the folks who are on this call right now who have stuck it through to the end. And I'm just really glad to have heard all the voices and looking forward to working with you all as we enter this new and exciting phase under Andrio. So thanks, Mark.
Oh, thanks for your comments, Jeff. David, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, much of an echo of what Jeff had just said, but I wanted to thank you personally for all of the incredible amount of work and planning and consensus building and community gathering that you do as ED for the Research Data Canada, but in particular for this summit. It's a tremendous amount of work. And I think it was a great success doing it virtually, and it's a pity that we weren't able to do it together, but maybe a future summit in the near future we will be able to. But again, thanks so much, Mark, for everything that you've done to make this happen.
All right, thanks, David. I definitely do look forward to seeing everybody again face to face, and hopefully having the opportunity to dine or chat over a drink or in the hallway as events move ahead. Okay, there's some additional comments in chat, so feel free to do the same. I think we're going to leave the Zoom meeting open until the top of the hour, so 20 minutes. For those that have some additional things they want to say to each other, you can always do so via chat or move off. No, we can't do breakout rooms anymore. And we'll keep the music off, as Chantel says. So feel free to hang out if you want. Otherwise, many thanks, and we'll see you all virtually or physically soon, I hope.